All right, can y'all see that one screen, growing blueberries? All right, I'm getting a nod from Wolf. So Jenny is going to monitor the chat box because I can't see that when I'm in presentation mode. So if you have questions, just unmute yourself and ask, or pop it there in the chat box, and we'll stop along the way and answer those as we go. So again, welcome, and here we go on Intro to Growing Blueberries.
Awesome. Hi, Melody.
Hey. I'm going to move this over here too so I can see. All right. So the joys of blueberries are a little bit broader than they are with strawberries. You know, we talked about strawberries last week. Most people like growing those because you get instant bang for your buck. You can basically be eating fruit within a year after planting, whereas with blueberries, you got to wait a little while. And if it doesn't teach you anything else, they will teach you patience. So as far as disease and insect pressure, we don't have a lot of that except for the spotted wing Drosophila fly, which some of you have heard me mention before. Typically our blueberries are going to be a little bit longer lived, especially some of the rabbit eye cultivars. That's why we suggest intermixing specific types, and we'll talk more about those in detail. The cool thing about blueberries is that there are a lot of newer varieties coming out of some of the land grant systems, especially Arkansas and NC State. And some of those varieties we're actually looking at on site in some of the research centers here in Tennessee as well. Health and flavor are going to vary across the board. It just is a matter of personal preference. You know, if you like the smaller blueberries or the larger ones, you can pretty much have your pick of health and flavor. And plus they add a nice addition to the landscape. You can see here you get something aesthetically pleasing through all 4 of the seasons. Even when they're budding, the bark is just unique, that slick bark with a little bit of a red tinge, and you can see the foliage there. We often get calls about the foliage because it does turn that red hue in the fall. So tonight we're just going to give you a broad overview of growing blueberries, specific types and cultivars. We're going to talk about site prep, and that's probably the biggest issue with blueberries. Give you some planting tips, and then just some basic plant management and pruning options, and then just a brief disease and pest management overview. For those of you that want a little bit deeper knowledge of the disease and pest management, after tonight you'll have those of you that this is your first night, you'll have access to our Google Drive, and you can go back to the So You Want to Grow Fruit series, and there's a pretty large portion there on just disease and insect pest. Okay, so getting into the overview, that first crop is going to be about 3 years from the time you plant. That's really hard for people to do, but we always suggest going through and pinching off the blossoms those first couple years, because it's really critical for you to focus those first years of production underneath the soil line. We want to push all of that plant's energy into its root zone the first couple of years. If we don't do that, blueberries are one that'll let us know pretty quick that they're not happy. And you'll notice as I move on through the presentation, we'll speak to that. You know, before we plant, we really want the soil to be where it needs to be in order to keep those blueberry bushes happy. It's a lot better on us in the long term if we do that. That second bullet there gets a little people sometimes, because that first full crop is going to be about your 6th to 8th year. But that is full crop. That doesn't mean you're not going to bear any fruit until the 6th year. It just means it's going to be about the 3rd year before you're really producing, but it's going to be year 6 before it reaches its full potential. Typically, again, depending on what type blueberry you're growing, you'll get about 15 pounds per plant. And ripening time, that's going to vary too. That's another reason we say to plant both types. Your high bush is going to be a little bit earlier fruiting than your rabbit eyes, which are going to be a little bit later in the summer. And I just like this schematic because it gives you that diagram again. You'll notice the -1 year. Again, that is the most critical time for blueberries before you even plant them in the ground. So oftentimes we'll tell people to take that whole year. If you decide, You know, you want to grow blueberries whether it's 2 plants or whether it's 20 plants. Make sure you do that soil pH or soil test and get that soil pH right before you plant, because I'm going to tell on ourselves right now. We planted blueberries as part of this trial out at the research station last year. And I told all the master gardeners, and they can attest to this, I was like, you know, do as I say, not as I do, because we were literally going in and putting sulfur on the ground a week before we planted. And we planted those blueberries April 18th. Well, we ended up that we lost a lot of plants this year. Number one, we knew that in a certain portion of the field, the field was holding water. But then we kind of got to looking at the plants this year when we went in to do some pruning and everything, and it's like, you know what, those plants, this ground is too acid. So we basically jerked that soil from a 6.8 down to a 4.3 last year. But we just did a soil test last week, and that soil pH is already back up to a 6.3. So we're going to have to go back and add more sulfur because we just replaced a lot of plants too. So basically what we've done is create work for me and the guys out at the research center, because we're going to have to continually be adding sulfur to that ground, because we didn't know that we were going to be doing that, you know, 6 months before we went into plant. It was one of those things, we submitted a grant and we got it and we just rolled with it. But this is where, again, you just really need to be the most cautious. Make sure you get that soil right before you plant. And I've already spoken about the acid soil. Think about blueberries as, because they are related to azaleas, and cranberries are all members of the heath family. So they're going to need that acidic soil to thrive and survive. They do like an organic, rich site. Anything that's more than 3% organic matter, they're going to do a little bit better on, especially rabbit eye, because they can be more forgiving as long as their other needs are being met. And they do like a well-drained soil. Some of you have heard me say before, blueberries they like those root hairs. So that's going to be a negative in a lot of different ways. It can, number one, fertility that touches those roots directly can burn your roots and then stunt your plant. But then also they like the root hair, so the root has to work harder to be able to take up water. And if those roots are just standing in water, then it just basically shuts down the plant. So that's why a lot of times you'll hear us talk about adding fluff to the ground, which is organic matter before you plant.
Melody, we have a question in the box.
Okay.
How long does pH treatment with sulfur last? And do we have to maintain the ground periodically, even if the soil is set up correctly?
Yes, that is a very good question. So basically what I was telling y'all was that we did it completely wrong. That's why we want you to take that first year before you plant to make sure that soil is where it needs to be, because you can actually amend that soil better and get it where it needs to be. So ultimately what you need to do is take a soil test, determine where you're at, make those sulfur applications, and retest again 6 to 12 months later to make sure that you have jerked that soil pH down where it needs to be. And actually, if you pull it on down lower initially, even to a 3.8 to 4.2, that's okay, because soil is going to revert back to its native pH over time. Now, probably one of the reasons the soil where we're located out there reverted so quickly is because there had been multiple liming applications. It was sod ground. So it just had a lot working against it for blueberry production in the first place. So yeah, it is going to be one of those things you're going to have to maintain. But if you spend that first year, get your soil pH down to about a 4.3, and then probably about every 3 years you'll need to soil test and make that application of sulfur. Does that answer your question? That is a good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The other cool thing, I kind of already alluded to this, is that blueberries do grow all over the Southeast. You'll often see them growing in the wild. You heard me mention a minute ago that they're a member of the heath family. Some of you have heard me talk about heath balds and grassy balds in the Appalachian range. So this would be one of those plants that would grow on a heath bald. Think about Max Patch or Big Bald or any of those balds here in the ranges close to us. And again, I've kind of already mentioned some of these, but they do have a really shallow root system as well, besides having no root hairs. And 50 to 60% of those roots are going to be in that top foot of soil, just about 8 to 12 inches from the crown of that plant when you plant it. And that's how it's going to maintain itself that way. Root growth is going to be impacted by irrigation and soil type, as well as that site prep. So what we mean by that is, we want to be irrigating, especially when they're first planted, but we don't want to be watering them to death. Because again, we don't want to get that ground to the point that it's oversaturated and stress the plant out. So this is when I would typically say, does anybody know what this is? But I can't see y'all. But like I said a minute ago, plants will tell you when they're unhappy. So if we see this phenomenon, and oftentimes folks will bring this into the office thinking that this is a disease issue, but it's really a physiological issue because it's iron deficiency. And some of you that have been in my soil pH classes have seen me stress the importance of soil pH for root development. So of course, this one being an acid-loving plant, that iron is going to be deficient if our soil pH is not low enough. And what happens is that when we get a deficiency of iron, which blueberries really need, then it's going to stunt those blueberries, and it's ultimately going to stop growth. And this is what we start seeing. This is how we know, because we get those variegated, or that veinal chlorosis with that red fringe around the edge of the leaf. But the sad thing is sometimes we can put a chelate, a type of fertilizer that's going to be specific for iron, but it's going to be really hard for those plants once they reach this stage to grow, or to grow out of that. So that's another reason we want to make sure we get that soil pH right, because once they get to this point, it's really hard to salvage. All right, so blueberry types, we have 3 different kinds I'm going to speak to. The rabbit eye, that's going to be our tallest and longest lived. They typically do very well here in Northeast Tennessee. They're going to be the latest to ripen, but they're also going to be more tolerant of heat and drought stress, which most of the time is a big issue. I don't know, we're almost to the 1st of May and it's been cold and wet, and it makes you wonder if we're ever going to see summertime, which I'm sure we will. But rabbit eye is going to be the type that's going to withstand that stress a little bit more. The northern high bush, that's going to be native to some of those New England states, so they're going to need a higher chill requirement, and don't worry, we're going to talk about that in a minute. They're going to be the most cold tolerant, but you're going to have more disease issues with the high bush. 9 times out of 10, if we get a sample in the office that has a disease issue, it's going to be a northern high bush. The third type there is the southern high bush, and this is one that's fairly new. It's been bred specifically for lower chill hours. It's just basically a hybrid between the rabbit eye and the northern high bush, but there's not been as many of these tested in Tennessee, so it's kind of hard to say right now how it is going to perform. But if you do purchase one of these, you want to make sure that you get a cultivar that's going to have a higher chill hour.
So we have another question.
Okay.
After the initial acidification of the soil, will adding evergreen needles as compost maintain the acid level?
It will not maintain the acid, but it will help, certainly. Anytime you're adding the pine needles, or even any kind of sawdust mulch that's high in acid, is going to help you maintain it lower. But again, soil is always going to want to revert to its native pH. So just keep that in mind. It's something that I'm not going to say that you're going to battle with, but it's something you're going to have to maintain. But it's just like if we have a lower pH soil for our gardens that are hitting on a 5.5, we have to go in and make that lime application to those, vegetable gardens or to our fields or whatever, every year or so. So it's basically the same thing. We're just going backwards on the scale. But yeah, you're always going to have to be maintaining it. Okay, so about chilling hours, this is just really quick, just a broad overview here. But there's a certain amount of cumulative hours of chill time that blueberries need in order to be able to produce blossoms and fruit the next year. So most high bush blueberries are going to have a chilling hour of about 800 to 1200 hours, which would work for Tennessee. And you're going to see that on the tag, or, you know, wherever you purchase your blueberries, you should really inquire about that. Southern high bush and rabbit eye are going to need a lower chilling hour. Some are going to be too low for Tennessee, so you want to select one that has at least a 500 to 550 chill hour. And you'll notice there on that little schematic, see if I can use my pointer, we're falling right up here in this range. So when we talk here in Northeast Tennessee, we're going to say a 1200 chilling hour. You'll notice though, as we get across the plateau and into the Delta area, their requirement's not going to be quite as high as us. So I just say that, you know, to use with caution when we're talking with friends across the state, because we are going to be a little bit higher, and we really do need to follow that chilling hour, because we need about 1200 cumulative hours to do that. And in the Google Drive, there will be a website link. I think it's NC State. I forget what it's called, but you can actually go in there and it will show you in real time what the chilling hours are. So you can follow that for specific varieties, whether it be apple trees, blueberries, peaches. It's just kind of a cool tool to have at your disposal. Okay, just to get into these a little bit more in depth, again, the rabbit eye is going to be a lot more soil adaptable, so they're going to be able to tolerate a little bit higher swing in that pH than your high bush is. They are going to be more heat and drought tolerant. They're going to live longer, but they're going to be huge plants compared to the high bush. They are going to fruit later than the high bush, and then their chilling hours, you can see they're going to be lower, 400 to 800. But again, just a word of caution, make sure that wherever you're buying your blueberry bushes from, that you get something with at least 500 to 600 chilling hours. Now, as far as cultivars, because we get a lot of questions on these in the extension office, let me look here. We have 3 of these oldies but goodies that we planted out at the research center. So like I say, we're in year 2, so hopefully in a couple years you'll actually get to come out and see those. We've got 10 different varieties planted. But that Tiff Blue is coming out of Georgia. It's a older, what we call the older standard. It's the go-to berry, if you will. It's got those smaller, medium-sized berries, and it's got a really good flavor. It always excels in the flavor department in blind test. Then Premier is one that has a really large berry, and it's going to fruit a little bit earlier. And it can be a little bit pH tolerant, probably more so than some of the other. Powder Blue, that's coming out of NC State, but it's a really, really light colored blue, and that throws people because it's almost like a transparent color blue, and that is how it's supposed to be. It's just, when it was bred that way, it just has that color. But cracking, and some of you may know what that is in tomatoes. Once tomatoes reach their, the point of growth, they stop growing. But if you don't, harvest that fruit and it gets rain or irrigation or whatever, then it turns that switch back on in the plant, and that's when we get those cracks in the fruit. Well, the same thing happens with blueberries. And that was one of the reasons that that variety was developed, was to reduce the cracking, especially in the higher elevations. And then the Climax variety is lower chill with a good flavor. Now, some of the newer, more promising cultivars coming out of Arkansas are the Ochlockonee. That's a late season berry, but it's got really good yields, and that's one that we do have in trials. And then Titan, that's a large rabbit eye fruit. It's got good flavor, good color. Vernon, some people don't like this one because it's so vigorous, and they're pruning the plant sometimes even in the summer months. But it is a later flowering plant, but earlier fruiting plant, so it's kind of reverse. And then Columbus is a large fruit mid-season harvest. Northern high bush, they're going to be a little bit more pickier about their site. They're going to prefer more even moisture, so irrigation is going to be a must. So if you're mixing your types, be really careful where you're placing these, because irrigation is going to be a little bit more critical for these northern high bush. And again, for whatever reason, you're going to have more disease issues, but you're going to have larger and earlier fruit. And just to speak to the fruit size, if you are one that really likes those great big blueberries in the summertime that are really juicy, then that's probably a high bush variety. If you like the smaller, more compact berry, those are typically your rabbit eyes. Northern high bush are going to have higher chilling requirement and therefore less risk of bloom loss, and they're going to do better in our higher elevation areas. So for most of us here in Northeast Tennessee, the high bush is going to perform well just because of elevation. Some of those cultivars, many of you have probably heard of Duke and Blueberry and the Blue Crop. All three of those are pretty popular. That Blueberry is really good for hot summers. And let's see, the Blue Crop is more of a compact plant. And then the Toro is a medium blue fruit. It's got mild flavor, and those fruits come in large clusters. And it's a really stocky plant, and it also withstands your drought a little bit better. And then Chandler's a newer variety, but it's got those really large berries too. Southern high bush, again, this was bred for commercial growers just to be able to harvest earlier in the summer, especially in places that will not support the northern high bush. Many chilling hours are going to be, did I just mute? Oh, it's saying, it's flashing up at me, unmute your speaker.
Yeah,
I can hear you.
I can hear you really well.
Yeah.
Okay, Jeannie, if you were talking, I couldn't hear you.
I can hear you well.
Oh, it may be me. It may have flipped speakers on me and I can't hear y'all. Okay.
Yeah, we hear you.
All right. Well, I'll figure that out in a minute. I'm just going to keep going. Let's see, where was that? Oh yeah. So Southern high bush, again, that's a relatively new cultivar for Tennessee, and we've not really tested that a lot, so we don't really know what to tell you on that. Legacy is one of those varieties that has been grown a little bit more than any of the others. Ozark Blue is one that's coming out of Arkansas. It's going to require that higher chill hour, so it may actually be better suited for Tennessee than some of the others. And then that Reveal, we've also got that out of the research center, but it's got a really narrow, almost more tall and cylindrical shaped is what that one looks like. And then it's supposed to have really small tasty fruit, so we'll see what that does. And this was at MTREC, Middle Tennessee Research Center in Spring Hill, and they've actually had blueberries in production there for several years. So that's one of the reasons we know how it'll perform, more so than some of the others. And then the three cultivars at each type, this one is here in Greenville and then also at MTREC. And then we've got a few Master Gardener demonstration gardens that are doing these across the state. So all of those that I've been talking about are what's planted. Well, you can see them listed here in trials. So hopefully next year and the next, y'all get to come out to the research center and see some of this stuff, you know, and be hands-on in the field with some of these things.
Melody,
See there,
another question.
Ozark Blue. It's a little bit lighter blue in color. That one's one that's being added to trial sites. It's always exciting to be on the cutting edge of some of these newer things coming out, because you get firsthand knowledge before it gets released to the public, and then when it does, you're like, oh yeah, I got to trial that in my own backyard for a few years. So, you know, kind of makes you feel, Okay, anyway, I digress. So as far as flavor, again, that's a matter of preference. You can see the picture there, a couple different sizes. Probably seen bigger and probably seen smaller. Skin texture is going to be different. Some are going to be a little bit thicker skinned. Some are going to make better jam and jellies than some of the others because some are going to be a little bit more seedy than others. And that's some part of the research that we're looking at too when we do get into some of these yield, taste testing and all that in a couple of years when we do start producing. And you'll notice their timing of fruiting and the pest. The spotted wing is really the only thing we have to worry about. But again, we don't want to leave fruit hanging on the bushes for too long because we want to pick right when they're ripe. That's what invites that pest to come in, because then that's when that skin starts getting a little bit looser and it is more penetrable to the spotted wing. Now, as far as the high bush pros and cons, it's hard to say go out and grow only high bush or go out and only grow rabbit eye, because they each have their quirks. So the high bush, again, you're going to have that earlier fruit, larger fruit, and you're going to be fruiting early enough to where you're not going to have issues. But you're not going to get long plant life, and you're going to have more disease risk, and they are going to be more sensitive about soil moisture. Wait a minute, I think
Melody.
you're trying to talk to me.
Melody,
And
can you hear
I
us?
need to go in here and figure out what's going on with my system.
Can you hear us? Hello.
Hey, I heard you. You're not where you need to be, but it's okay. I can hear you. Okay.
There's a couple questions.
Okay.
Actually, let me find my mouse. Do you have any information on the new dwarf blueberries for containers?
Yeah, there's a slide in here about that.
Okay. And then how susceptible to frost damage are these?
Blueberries can really withstand frost damage. I mean, of course, the blossoms are going to be right on the fringe. This year, I don't think we had any loss from some of those later frosts that we did experience. It's not going
I
to be.
didn't have any, and I've got a blueberry butterfly bush right in between 4 of mine, and the butterfly bush got the frost.
Yeah, I mean, I typically, when I think frost or freeze in the springtime, I don't get anxious about the blueberries, and it wasn't anything we stressed about out at the research center, because they can withstand lower temps and even cumulative cold temperatures and be okay and survive that.
Okay,
Good question.
that's it.
Okay, rabbit eyes, you've heard me mention these already, but they are going to be tolerant again of that pH swing and moisture management. So if you do have some wetter areas, I'm not saying they're going to do okay in those wet areas, but they're going to be able to withstand that a little bit better than what your high bush would until you can remedy that problem. And sometimes it's just like at the research station. We didn't know that was going to be an issue until after we had already planted. And then sometimes you may need to go in and add some drainage tiles, or, add some additional organic matter or whatever to help relieve that issue. The bad thing with rabbit eyes is that they are going to fruit later, which is going to make that spotted wing a little bit more of a nuisance. And sometimes you might need to manage those a little bit better. And of course, you're picking in the hottest part of the summer. Well, now it's like what is going on with my computer? Y'all. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's your compact container, and I think they're just so cute.
Beautiful.
Yeah. But you'll notice there maybe some more marketing than merit there, because they're not always going to bear like that. It's going to be really hard on the plant. I mean, look at look at what's in the pot versus what's above the pot. It's not very balanced. That's probably a good analogy there. Consistent moisture is going to be the biggest issue with this. So they are going to be hard to manage in a container. Now, whether you're doing some of these dwarf varieties or whether you're actually trying to grow a high bush or a rabbit eye in containers, and I've seen people try to do that. And I'm not talking about raised beds, but I'm talking about like an actual container like this. It's really hard to be able to manage, especially just the moisture levels.
We have another question.
Okay.
Do you have any information on the O'Neill cultivar?
No, but
No.
we'll write that down and see if I can find out something. And I think in our handout, in our Blueberry publication, I think we have a couple of these compact varieties too. So I'll check on them. I'll make sure that's in there. If not, I know we have that somewhere. I'll find it, put it in Google Drive.
Do you think the dwarfs would be okay to grow in landscape beds?
Probably, as long as you can keep the moisture consistent, yeah. I'd like to have a little bit more experience with those. You know, I've not seen those other than what we're getting out of just some of the trial gardens, but I've not actually seen those. Okay, so again, I've kind of touched on some of these. Planting before you plant, year 0 is, again, the most critical time. And I'm not going to speak to all that because I've already given you my sermon on these, but make sure that organic matter, I know I touched on that a minute ago, but make sure that you get that mixed in prior to planting. Avoid that bucket effect. Be real careful if you're using manure or any compost that's going to raise the pH. We don't want to make the soil too hot either. And when you are purchasing, just make sure, some of you have heard me say this multiple times, but really investigate those plants. You know, if you're purchasing at a box store, you know, take it out of the pot, look at its root system, get intimate with it, and make sure you know what you're purchasing before you take it home. And as far as those varieties, just really study those varieties to know what fits your situation. And without a soil test, it's going to be really hard to know what that situation is. And I'm not trying to sell y'all a soil test, but I think if there's one area of the garden that really, really needs a soil test, it's going to be blueberries or any of those acid-loving plants, but especially blueberries, because you're going to invest a lot of time, money, and energy, effort. And if you don't do it right to start with, then it's just going to come back and bite you in the butt, and it's going to be hard to salvage. So focus on year 0. You'll notice here, just destroying any perennial weeds and grasses. We don't want any competition when we do plant. A prior cover crop to suppress weeds. Sometimes folks will use ryegrass because it will help. It's got that alleliopathic effect, which will help suppress germination of certain weed species. And then, of course, you want to plant your dormant plants in February to March. We don't want to be planting any later than that. See, I just told on myself again because last year we planted in April and mid-April to beat the band. But what that does is create more stress for that plant. So the earlier you can get it in when it's dormant, the better off that plant's going to be. It's going to be able to sustain itself longer. Raised beds, those can actually be a pretty tremendous asset. Now, raised bed, I mean either you're building a raised bed specifically for your blueberries, or if you're going in bare ground, you're actually belving up, you know, creating a berm, creating a raised bed to plant those blueberries in. That's not always a bad practice.
We have another question.
Okay.
The chill hours refers to how cold it gets and how long it stays cold, but how cold does it have to be? Below freezing?
Yeah, anything below 32. And
Okay.
specific, the reason I didn't mention that number, I mean, when you, and I should have pulled it up so I could show it to y'all, but when you get that website link and you go in there and you start playing around, it'll give you a specific temperature range for each crop that'll be specific even to cultivar and variety, but typically it's going to be below that 32-degree mark.
Okay. And the amount of sunlight, full sun, morning sun, afternoon shade?
Actually, they're going to prefer to be in full sun, but morning sun if you're going to have shade. And planting on a slope is not a bad thing, or like I said, the raised bed, or if you go on a little bit of an incline, because you're going to get a little bit better drainage that way, depending on your soil type. And
Thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, you just do it on the same orientation because again, you get that morning sun to dry off. But it's not as critical with blueberries as it would be for grapes, because that foliage, you know, you got more of a waxy cuticle versus the foliage like on a grape. When you do get your plants, if you're ordering bare root plants, you just want to make sure those bare roots don't dry out. So you need to get them in some soil. And then you typically want to keep them or put them in a bucket of water like an hour before you plant them. So just make sure that they're staying moist. If you can't get them planted pretty quick, just till them in the ground. That's what we had to do in Greenville this year. We had to just basically heel them in for a couple of weeks until we could plant them where they needed to go. Just don't let those roots dry out.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Are they okay as a hedge type plant? I would say if you want blueberries to produce, you need to give them the 4 to 5 foot between rows.
Yeah, you can use them as a hedge. I actually have a neighbor that does that, but they've got them adequately spaced. You know, I remember when they first planted them, my other neighbor was like, "What are they doing? That's ridiculous." But now that they've filled in, it's a nice little barrier. It keeps one neighbor from looking at the other neighbor, I guess. But yeah, make sure you get the proper spacing and you can actually utilize it as a hedgerow. And it's an edible hedgerow too,
There you
so
go.
even better. When you do plant, just make sure that you dig the hole large enough to be able to spread those roots out. Make sure you firm the soil around them. Don't just scruff the dirt up around it. You know, make sure you get the dirt in there. I say that because you'd be amazed at how sometimes people don't do that. And then make sure you just water in well right after you plant. Any amount of moisture those roots can use initially right after planting, the better off they're going to be. And I've already said this about the pH. I just keep harping on it. If you don't learn anything else tonight, it's just that before you plant blueberries, you got to have that soil pH right. And you'll notice there that bucket issue in heavy soils. And again, we're seeing that out at the research center. But clay soil is a beast when it comes to blueberries. So again, getting that organic matter incorporated before you plant is going to be so beneficial. And then sandy soils, we don't have a lot of those except maybe along the Nolichucky, but just not letting those roots dry out. And you'll see here from this picture, that's a 3-year-old plant. So planted 3 years ago. It's not really done much, has it? So the root ball is still much like the container it was planted from. So basically, when it was taken out of the pot, those roots, I'm pointing to the wrong one. Y'all can't see what I'm doing. Good grief. Okay, now you can see my mouse. But basically, those roots should have been pruned when it was taken out of that container, because bulked up like this for 3 years, those roots have had nowhere to go. They've just not been able to expand and go explore. They've been in isolation from COVID-19. So there they are. There they still sit. You can see the effects. But yeah, that's you can't really see the foliage here, but you can see some red. It's amazing that that plant's even still alive after all of that. We've kind of already alluded to a little bit of this, but mulching is going to be really critical just because of that, keeping that soil moisture consistent, which is going to help increase survival of the plant and increase growth. You're going to be able to reduce temperature fluctuations too, especially this time of year, and then again in the fall. It's going to help with some of that heaving issue that we have when the ground freezes and thaws in the wintertime. And believe it or not, it can increase yields. This is actually out at the station. This is a pine bark mulch, but we used a little bit of wood chips as well. So there is discussion on whether wood chips could lead to faster rises in pH. And you're going to get opinions on both sides of the fence with that one, actually. So it's usually not going to be an issue if the pH was properly adjusted before we planted. But anything that's uncomposted, like the wood chips or sawdust, it does have that potential to tie up nitrogen. especially as they break down if there's a lot of soil contact. So I don't know if you can see this little berm. We didn't necessarily plan on a raised bed. Dr. Lockwood was not happy with us about that, by the way, but we kind of created our own raised bed kind of during the planting and afterwards with the mulch bed. But again, you know, sometimes we need a reality check on weed growth. This is in Spring Hill, but this was last season, and I think they went back and put the weed cover on after the fact. And same thing here at Greenville, we're going to be putting the same thing on because nutsedge is such a pressure. You just cannot control it. So there is an organic mulch that's under this black plastic mulch as well, which is going to help with those moisture fluctuations. Again, you can see the drip tape laid out through there, but again, you've got that level of mulch, what you just saw in the previous slide, that's underneath this.
And how tall or thick would you do the mulch? About
3 to 4. You can get away with 3 to 6. You just don't want it, let's see. That's not a really good picture. I don't know if you can kind of see how that's dug away from the plant right there. It's not right up against the stem of that plant. You don't want to do that. You want to rake that out and away from the plant. I don't think I've got a picture that shows that any better. That's a good question though. The deeper you can get that mulch layer, the more consistent your moisture is going to be, as well as helping with that weed suppression. As far as your plant management, water management, that black plastic mulch that you just saw the picture of, that's going to last for several years. You're not going to have to replace that every year. Or an organic mulch that's going to be free of weeds. You know, some people have taken straw in before just as the first or second year growth, and sometimes weeds have come from that. So you just got to be careful with your source wherever you're getting the mulch. And again, just remember those first 3 years, we want to focus all of that roots or that plant's energy into the root system. So again, we're focusing on watering that plant, keeping everything consistent, and then it's not going to be as critical an issue after that 3-year mark. And you'll see there, most of the water is going to be taken up from top 6 inches of the soil, and you're going to need about 1 inch per week in the season. Okay, this is a plant right after it was planted, and you can see that
advancing. Oh, there it goes.
You see it?
Yeah,
okay.
Now we do.
Okay, so you can see that the root ball from the pot is just barely covered with soil, so it's not too deep. The irrigation line is going to be visible there, and you've got the emitter that's actually going to the root system. And
There you go.
And again, this plant was planted a little bit later in season just because, if y'all remember last year, it was so wet for so long. We couldn't get in the fields. So that's the reason it's leafed out. Otherwise, when you plant blueberries, you wouldn't have any foliage there. So you really don't want to see that. But that gives you an idea of what it's going to look like.
Quick question back to the black plastic. After 3 years, would you remove it and replace it? Or is the 3-year mark just a typical wear?
3 years, well, that's a typical wear, but if you use that black plastic for the first 3 years, then you could remove that once it's done its thing. I mean, it'll be ripped and broken and shattered and all that good stuff. You could actually remove that at that point. And if you've got the weeds to the point that they can be controlled and you can get by with just adding an organic mulch, you can do it that way. Because when you go in to put that plastic on larger plants, you're having to cut that X in that plastic and try to drape it, it can actually be more detrimental to the plant. So if you're going to go this route, if you've got heavy weed pressure, even if you're just growing 5 or 6 plants, you can still go this route. But then after 3 years, remove it and just go to an organic mulch.
Thank you.
Okay, as far as fertility, again, that soil test is going to tell you where you need to be, but it's going to be really simple and efficient to fertilize those individual plants. You're only going to need to apply phosphorus and potassium, and that's only if your soil test indicates that. Again, you got to be careful. You don't want to burn those plants because the roots have no root hairs. Here is an important one. Fertilize accurately. Where'd my mouse go? Don't add extra for good measure. A little dab more will not be good. It'll actually be more detrimental. And if you can get the ammonium form of nitrogen, they prefer that a little bit better just because they're salt sensitive. And that just means that they're going to accumulate salt, and you'll often see that even on the crust in the soil. But I do realize too that ammonium is not an easy nitrogen to get a hold of now. One of the other things that water is going to be critical, especially those first 3 years, is because salt stress can be enhanced by drought stress. So if you don't have irrigation, back off on your fertility a little bit. It's better to do that than to fertilize without the irrigation mechanism in place. And you'll notice here, this is just a broad spectrum here. This is not necessarily going to fit everybody, just kind of generally speaking, but it may not be necessary to fertilize that first year anyway. Kind of, again, depends on what your soil test says, but if you do, you want to wait till you see that first flush of growth, and that's going to typically occur a few weeks after you do your planting when they're dormant. And you'll see there, then apply 1 to 2 ounces in a 1 to 2 foot circle around the base of that plant. But do make sure that it's an acid-loving fertilizer. As far as pollination, some can be partially or even self-fruitful. Typically, that's going to be your high bush, so be aware of that. Any of your blueberries are going to benefit from cross-pollination. And the cool thing is that pollination is done by bees, primarily the bumblebees. Actually, I've got a picture of that here in a minute. So I'll show you how they actually vibrate that pollen. But bloom times of your cultivars should overlap. So again, when you're planning for these different types, make sure that they do overlap to enable that cross-pollination to occur. But you can see there how they sonicate or vibrate the pollen from the flowers. So we've had a lot of folks that have planted blueberries and come in thinking that they've had an issue with like carpenter bees, and it's like, no, those are bumblebees, because bumblebees actually pollinate better than even your traditional honeybees for blueberries. When you open the Google Drive, there's going to be a separate video in there on blueberry pruning. It's about 5 minutes long that Celeste put together. So it's going to show you better than what I can show you in these slides. So just make sure that you pull that up and watch it later for some pruning practices. Yeah.
2 questions. If plants were put into the ground within the past 5 days and none of the pre-planting soil work was done, is there anything that can be done to compensate for pH, like diluted vinegar or anything you recommend?
If plants have been planted in the last 5 days and there was no soil pH or no soil test done?
No pre-planting soil work was done. Take them out and start again?
Well, I mean, honestly, that's what my guts. I was trying to be nice. Yeah, I would, it's just 5 plants. I would, I think I
don't know how many plants. Wes, how many plants? 4. Yeah, 4.
Well, I tell you, I think what I would do is maybe move them, if that's where you want them to be, hill them in maybe somewhere else, do your soil test. I'm telling you, if that pH is sitting above a 6, it's going to be really hard for those plants to thrive. So I don't know if I wouldn't do a soil test, determine where that's at, and then if it's higher than 6, I would go ahead and try to incorporate the sulfur in at the sides, or even move them, hill them in somewhere else just to let them rest or live for a little while, and try to amend that soil and move them later in the fall. If your soil pH is above a 6, you could make an application of sulfur, but you're going to be like playing catch up. if that makes
But
sense.
if your soil is good,
Yeah,
if
if your soil's good, just
pH is good, then you might not need to do a thing.
right.
So
But
it's all about soil testing. Can you use anything other than sulfur?
no, you're gonna have to use a sulfur compound, ammonium sulfate, pure sulfur, elemental sulfur. You're gonna have to use something with sulfur because that's the only thing that's gonna be able to jerk that pH down.
And then one more question, the recommended fertilizing schedule for twice a year. I know it's springtime before May, definitely.
Yeah, and it's gonna vary. Yeah, first year and second year and then third year, it's all gonna vary. That's in that publication that you're gonna get in the Google Drive.
Okay.
So you'll have a diagram for each one of those years, and then as that plant grows, what you need to do. Good
Brenda, did that answer the question?
Are we good?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So again, make sure you go in and watch Celeste's video on pruning, but always remember when you first plant, you're gonna be pruning that plant. So for bare roots, you want to prune those smaller, lower shoots and then just tip shoots, because what you're doing is removing those flower buds. I know. See, this is one time I'm glad I'm a yellow person, because I'm always afraid people are going to throw things at me. But you really do want to remove those buds. Remove the fruit buds prior to bloom, and that's going to help push that vegetative growth, which is what we want to do. And again, if it's a container pot, prune those roots too. We want to give those roots room to grow. And you can see a diagram there just of the fruit buds. So the fruit buds are going to be larger, and they're going to be found on the top 2 to 3 inches here of the shoot. And then fruit buds that are found on the previous year growths are smaller, more pointed, or this are your leaf buds, smaller and more pointed, found on the lower portions. A lot of folks don't realize that you have both buds on the same shoot. So that's kind of how that works. And there you can just see that leaf bud, and then fruit buds. So you can see a big distinct difference there. So again, we count from planting when that plant's going to start bearing. And again, you're going to remove the fruit in the first and second year, and then let them bear on the third year. But you're still going to, prune to remove about 50% of the buds during dormancy. And you can just go through and actually rub them all for tip shoot them. Pruning, just remember, some people get a little nervous, especially on plants, first, second year, but that's going to help train that young plant. So basically all you're doing is helping to renew that older wood. That's just going to help maintain the strength of that overall plant. Just removing 10 to 20% of the older canes each year is going to be a good rule of thumb. And Celeste will actually show you that in that video. And then again, how fast and vigorous a plant is growing is also going to determine pruning. But you can see there, you want to get a nice clean cut. You don't want to have any, zigzag chop. You don't want to be doing it with your finger or with an old dull knife, because you don't want no ragged edges there. You want to cut it clean, because then that's going to help reduce any disease or insect pathogens from coming in. And you can just see some of the pictures of what that's going to look like. And again, this is going to make more sense when you see Celeste video. But basically what you want to do is remove those weak shoots, get that plant to growing upward, because you don't want fruit. Let me grab my mouse again. You don't want fruit down here. Number one, that's going to make it hard on you, right? But you want to have the fruit up here, because it's going to be more stable for that plant. So on the mature plants, you want to narrow that base. You want to get rid of those small twiggy lower shoots, remove any crossover or low angle canes, remove any canes that are 1 to 3 or remove 1 to 3 older canes, I'm sorry, and then head back if you need to, and then just thin those canes in the upper portion of the plant. Again, it's all about balance, and you can kind of see what we're talking about here. A lot of people will not even prune their blueberry bushes, but if we do that, we're going to maintain the vigor in that plant. And the only reason that you'd probably want to prune these is again, just thinking of you as the picker. It's going to be easier to pick from here than it is here. So on high bush, and you can see how much more spready they are versus the upright stature of the rabbit eye. So you want to, again, remove any of those weak canes down here, because that's just going to take away from that upright growth. It's going to take away from the vitality of that plant. But you can see what we want that, I'm not going to say it looks like an apple tree, but the more air movement we can get in there and get rid of some of this, because all that it's doing is taking away from actual fruit growth. So the more we can open that canopy up, then the more fruit production we're actually going to get. And again, it's just about being able to maintain that plant height. As far as harvesting, you want to do that, of course, when it's cool. You want to have that uniform blue color, that whitish, waxy appearance. Just because it's blue does not necessarily mean it's sweet, because a lot of those cultivars are going to vary in their color. So make sure you do the taste test. But you're going to be harvesting about every 5 to 7 days. And again, that's going to depend on like the weather the last 2 days. If we had weather conditions like that, you know, for a couple of days, and then maybe had 1 day of sunshine, and then we go back to that wet, overcloud, you know, it's not going to be as consistent. But making sure that you are harvesting when you can, then that's going to help reduce disease and insect pressure. And you want to store berries as quickly as you can, and you can actually store them for up to 3 weeks.
Quick question. Do
Okay.
you have any nursery suggestions, online or physical, that you could recommend for purchasing plant stock?
Yes, that is also in that publication. Or it might be a separate document, but yes, I have pulled that together for you.
Thank you.
And we use, I think we actually use 3 or 4 different ones for like what we did out at Greenville. So it just kind of depends on the cultivar that you're wanting. This is the spotted wing. Some of you were on here a few weeks ago and we talked about this little booger, but it used to be that blueberries and pear trees you could grow relatively simple with no insect or disease pressure at all. But then this thing came to be a little invasive species, and it's kind of changed things up a bit. You can kind of see what some of that damage is going to be. But the sad thing is that you don't always see this when you're picking. You're not always going to be fortunate enough, especially if it's in low numbers. But you can actually see the larva there that's emerging from the fruit, and maybe this was overripe fruit. That's another reason we say make sure you're harvesting, you know, when the fruit's ripe. Don't leave it lingering. The bad thing about spotted wing is that they can produce those multiple generations throughout the season. So populations are going to be pretty high. And they do have a certain affinity for specific crops. I mean, they're going to probably tend to go to grapes, blackberries or caneberries, even tomatoes a little bit more than they would the blueberry, just again because of that thick waxy cuticle. But as you can tell, we are experiencing damage from these now. So the biggest issue, or the biggest thing, is just not to let that fruit get overripe. That's typically when we see more of an issue. Then you can see from, wait a minute, what happened to my, y'all see the hand with the mummy berry in it? It's on one screen, but it's not on the other. Okay. It's almost kind of like cutting open a, what do you call that? The seed in the wintertime. If it's a shovel, it means lots of snow. If it's
Pomegranate.
a pomegranate.
Pomegranate.
Yeah. When you cut it open, it almost kind of looks like a pomegranate. But that's the mummy berry, and you can kind of see what it's going to look like. The foliage is going to tell you that this is mummy berry. See that red interveinal chlorosis we got going on there? Kind of looks like a river, red river. And then if you see these little spore thingies growing along the ground, then that's going to give you an idea too that we have mummy berry. Oh, somebody question. Then we have the Phomopsis twig blight. And sometimes folks will just think it's a dying branch and it's nothing to worry about. But if you see something like that, investigate it a little bit closer because you may actually have a fungal disease. One of the best things you can do though is actually rake and remove all that plant litter, especially the mummy berries as they fall on the ground. You saw that little encapsulated berry there. Make sure you're removing all that. Burn that if you can, and if you need to spray a fungicide, and this PB1622 is also in the Google Drive for you. If you have a high prevalence of this, like if you've seen that in the past, and you know it's going to be an issue every year for you, so you might want to do a preventative fungicide. Usually, we don't recommend that though. You can usually get by just pruning all that stuff out, and then of course.
A mummy berry is one that never ripened, correct? I mean, literally.
Right. And it's got that white color on the inside when you cut it open. Yeah. So wildlife can be an issue. You don't want to do all this work and feed the birds, so you may have to invest in some blueberry netting. But that's a relatively low cost, and lots of different places are going to have this available. Lots of different ways that you can get these placed with blueberries, and you're still going to get good airflow in there. If you have ponytails, ladies, be careful. It can be dangerous. Or if you wear sunglasses on top of your head, remove those before entering a blueberry net, because otherwise there will be scissors involved and it could get ugly. So I'm just warning you. So again, blueberries really suit your lifestyle. It's all about pairing your site, what you have at your location, with the type. And it may be that you're fortunate enough to be able to grow the high bush and get away with only high bush. It may be that you just grow rabbit eye, or you may be growing a mix of both, or you may even have some southern high bush. But really knowing what your site is and what it's going to be better suited for is going to be better for you in the long run. As far as the pruning and pH management and pest control, I think it all goes back to that pH management. If we can get that under control to start with, all this other stuff just falls into place. And one of Natalie's favorite quotes, success is largely a factor of avoiding failure. So,
But don't be afraid to try.
Yeah, exactly. But so that's kind of the broad synopsis of blueberries. And there's a lot of crops, a lot of different types, a lot of cultivars. When we spoke about strawberries last week, we could pretty much throw them all up there on a slide and say, this is your options. Pick a few, go forth and grow fruit. With blueberries, it's impossible to list them all. But if you're really serious about growing some of these different cultivars, really look into Arkansas, Georgia, and NC State, because some of these newer cultivars they've got coming out are really promising, really cool, and it's always fun, again, to be kind of on that cutting edge. So